First things first, how are you?
Doing good.
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes going on here.
It's a crazy world at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very crazy world, and we feel lucky we live in a house with some other artists and just trying to stay creative and keep your head up. I think we are also
process together.
Yeah, totally. We're having lots of long conversations about representation in the music industry, and there's a lot of good readjustment happening here, and a lot of work still to be done to sort of tackle the overbearing whiteness of the music industry in Canada. And so that's been a real focus as of late, is just conversations like that, and lots of protests and stuff here to kind of try to shake it up a little bit.
And is that kind of part of being self-isolated in this time is that you do, at least I noticed it in myself, that you do reflect a lot on kind of what you've been through and how the world works. So is that true for you as well, where you not only look at kind of the world as it is now, but what you've done in the past couple of years with the music that you've made?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, it's definitely an introspective time.
Yeah.
You just kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think there's like I feel like there's something very related in terms of changing that sort of status quo of where we're at, and with the pandemic, just in terms of telling everyone to press pause and take note of where they're at. I think that, when it comes to us, I think that we spent years on the road where it was more about driving forward than kind of looking out the window, and seeing where we are. It was just sort of very kinetic forward movement. And I think that making this record, we came off the road right as, I don't know, all of these things that happened, Trump had been elected, and Brexit and all of this stuff. And so I think that it sort of forced us into a state of taking stock of where we were in the world. And I think it sort of infiltrated our lyrics, even though a lot of the album isn't necessarily like overtly political. I think that there's a real sense of like a time capsule of what 2020 is in the lyrics.
Also, even though, so you've heard the album, but it's like obviously not out till July 10th. And we had this plan to obviously release the album before coronavirus and before isolating happened. And even with that, you kind of feel like more care needs to be taken with how you are releasing art and taking up space. And then obviously with this massive paradigm shift that's, forcing people to write. I don't mean forcing in a bad way. I think it's a very amazing thing. But to, look at your own whiteness and look at the amount of space that you've been able to, that you've been allotted without, without necessarily working for that as hard as other people have had to. And so there's definitely, with this album more than previous albums, a lot of thought and care and just discussion about, how do you release music responsibly right now? And I hope that doesn't go anywhere. I hope that that's something that, I think over the past 4 years at least there's been like this kind of underlying conversation of how to take up space and using platforms in a way that's responsible and with awareness of privileges and stuff like that. And so I think that this album, we're definitely We're definitely moving cautiously.
Well, here's a question then, in terms of kind of what you just mentioned, because obviously, and unfortunately, this isn't the first time that these issues have risen to the top. I mean, we've had Michael Brown, we have had Rodney King, all these. I mean, you can go through every month of the past 10 years and you can find incidents and cases. So are you hopeful that this time the change will be real and it will stick in a way?
Oh, it's so hard to know. Everything is so unpredictable now. I find with the election year in the States and so much tension, I don't feel really prepared to know whether, I have no idea what's to come. Sure. But I would say that the stakes feel much higher than I've ever experienced in my lifetime. And I think the fact that the election is in November and the States has had such a tumultuous presidency, and there's a lot of tension there, it makes me feel that the stage is set for real change. I think that to see the number of even conservatives that are really identifying how badly things need to change is a good sign. But it's really hard to know. I mean, I think that something that you kind of realize with some of the resources going around is that like it's all kind of stepping stones based. Like, for instance, like the response to Michael Brown would not be be what it was without what happened with Rodney King and the race riots in the 90s and the civil rights movement beforehand. And all of these things had sort of, it's easy to look back and see sort of like naiveties within the responses that like we know now and be all high and mighty about it. But you kind of realize that actually that's where we're at now as well. So as much as I think people right now really want a quick answer, and I don't think it's probably really going to come, but I think that finally, I think we're having real conversations about institutional funding and how police and different institutions aren't necessarily serving everyone equally. And at least here, the conversation is really productive when it comes to health and wellness checks. So when something's happening, like the mental health calls, and maybe someone shouldn't be walking in with a weapon, and maybe there's more outreach worker kind of stuff response. I think changes like that would be extremely, it would be amazing if those went through. It's harder to look within a larger perspective and know.
Sure. But I do think that right now there's, this seems to be a time when, that change has to happen on a systemic level right now, immediately. But there's also time and capacity for relearning history in the way that it actually unfolded, and to look at the root of the problem, which is that we've been taught a very problematic, one-sided version of history for our whole life. And obviously here in Canada, that also extends to how it's changing now. But like when we were kids growing up in Canada, we didn't learn about settler colonialism in the way that it actually happened, and about the genocide of First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada. And obviously, these systems that oppress do it not to just one group of people, but to it affects essentially everyone who isn't white. So so to be, I think that to me it feels different in the way that we've had this like global great pause, and we've always known that the way to this, at least that it has to start with re-education and actually learning that this, like what white supremacy is and how it came to be. And that takes going back hundreds and thousands of years, and actually kind of like starting at the beginning. And I think that, because of this great pause, like we have time to do that. Whereas in the past, it's often like, yeah, that's really overwhelming. I don't really have time to look at that. I'm going to, click donate and then go on with my life or whatever. And I guess I feel grateful for that time to be able to just really dive in. And I think we all have the opportunity to like be educated in a way that maybe our institutions and our school systems have, and our society have just like failed. And
I think everybody should read Howard Zinn. Do you know his book, The People's History of the United States? It's kind of he writes from the perspective of all the minorities and those kind of things. And he goes through a lot of those incidents where he writes from the perspective of, the disenfranchised, which is really interesting. But yeah, and like you, I am optimistic. I think from what I've seen, and obviously it's less over here than it is in the States, and I suppose Canada. But people seem to get together as well. Either police officers and protesters, they seem to be on the same side in a way at times. So that's at least already hopeful to me that there is a conversation going there. But yeah, you never know. So let's talk about some more fun things, which is the music that you've made. Because you say, well, you're writing this album in a period where all this tumultuous stuff is going on. When you start writing, do you write with a goal, or does stuff do songs come out? Do they fall out?
I think this one might have been a bit different. I think in the last one, I was like, okay, go into the studio and make a record. But I think that this one, we have our friend that lives quite close in our neighborhood, and he had this old coach house in the backyard, sort of like a shed. And he just let us set up there for like a good 8 months or so and write. And so it was very open-ended, like it was like different members of the band just kind of cruising in every day, and we worked on all of these song ideas, and there was 40 or 50 ideas kind of running around, and some days would be really focused and intense, and then some days were really laid back and just sort of like smoking hash and just allowing the ideas to just kind of like blossom in the way that they wanted to. And I think that more so than in the past, I think we just kind of like listened to the songs and let the songs do the directing. And so it was a really special writing process, because I didn't, as a personal statement, I didn't really feel like we had to write like a radio record or an album to like fit into some sort of box. It felt quite free to kind of just do what we want. And when I listen to the record now, I think every song is just sort of allowed to be what it is. It's not like we wanted one sound and one thing. Like it's just sort of like some songs Leah brought in that we were all just like, that's a beautiful song. Let's like play that song and just let it inform how it wants to sound itself, So it was a really special sort of laid back process, as opposed to, I think that on Touch, on the last one, like second records usually are, you're just really fighting for an audience, and you really want people to notice you. And so maybe we were more prone to kind of diving into the more confrontational sort of music, which is awesome. And I'm excited to play more of that kind of stuff. But I think that it was fun this time to kind of just let the music do the talking.
Well, one song, and you can jump in here if you like at any point. But one song that to me sounded a little bit different, but still captures very well what you do, is Champagne, which is almost it almost to me sounds a bit gospel-y, or it goes towards gospel and at times. So how does a song like that come together? Is it just trial and error?
Yeah, well, that song was written in collaboration with James Baley and Kyla, who are two amazing artists here in Canada, and they had joined our band like a few times on stage playing live performances, and we started writing it about 2 years ago. It came musically from an idea that Pete had. And originally it had different lyrics, but But especially I think because it's like a gospel influenced song, it was impossible to extract the fact that there's a history of white artists and non-Black artists capitalizing on the music created by Black artists and Black culture. And so the four of us kind of got together and used it as an opportunity to have some discussions that we had, that had always like existed in the air. They happened to be two Black musicians, and obviously they joined our band because they were friends and they were great singers. And
so they would sing like backup vocals for Touch when we were touring that, but we had never worked with them in collaboration, like writing together, but we became quite close.
And obviously just being on stage, it's like to be an all white band and have two Black backup singers, that's loaded. And we realized that we needed to talk about how that was loaded. And then
sorry to interrupt. What was their perspective? How did they see kind of being part of your band?
I think you'd have to ask them.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Right now, it's like we should not try and speak on behalf.
Well, fair enough. That makes sense.
I think that our side of it with that song was that, like, we've just seen a lot of bands, put the gospel vibe on and kind of take advantage of it. And it's such a direct. It's very direct, like sort of theft of Black culture, right? Is to have this white band doing a gospel song. And so it just became a really cool collaboration where we tried to subvert that. Like we tried to say, how can we actually make this song that's about that and play with like old sampling and the history of sampling and Motown and things like this. Like, I think it's a really, it's just us trying to start the conversation, but yeah, maybe we can have another chat with James and Kyla and actually unpack it together.
No. As you said that makes sense. I don't know. I should ask them.
But James James has a lot of experience and a lot of love for church music and gospel music, and the first time I met him, I heard him kind of sing like a spiritual song that was called "I Need You to Survive," and it's just so beautiful. But he wrote that part of the sample that like sounds like it's and has been produced in a way that is supposed to sound like it's taken from a 60s group or a 60s spiritual or whatever. But he wrote that and. And it kind of like added a whole other level to the song when that came about, like to be able to add to be able to actually reference the thing of like stealing. But in this case it's like he wrote it, so it's like it's not, but yeah.
Anyway, we should talk about it with them. I think
fair enough. But yeah, that I just that song really stuck out to me. I really like that one. And there's a couple tracks I want to get into specifically, but more in general. Then, when did you arrive at a point where you thought, okay, now we're heading towards kind of forming an album? Did you have a couple of songs or was there a turning point, so to say?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the album really took shape when we sort of started recording with this guy named Burke Reed. He did all the Courtney Barnett records as well as this band called the Drones that we really like from Australia. And so he came over and we recorded at like a farm studio. And I think he just kind of took our band to another place. I think he allowed the songs to breathe and sort of, like I said earlier, sort of like speak for themselves in a really cool way. And his taste was so good. And I think that's when we really understood what the album was kind of going to be. Which is a lot of fun. I think that as a band, you often you can get caught up thinking about your music as singular ideas, sort of being sewn together. Mm-hmm. And I think the real magic happens. And when Burke took us to that studio and we started recording and working on the songs with him, there's a moment where the songs become their own entity that's like above you, and you don't know how to talk to them or anything because they're almost intimidating and like and have like their own forces and stuff. And I think all five of us plus Burke plus Niles the engineer, like we got the songs to a point where they were kind of floating above us, and we would just sort of shape them, almost like kneading, bread dough or something like that. I think that like we really started recognizing the power of songs outside of our own brains. You have a vision, but what happens when that vision of the song exits your brain and just and sort of exists on its own? And I think that was really what happened when we started recording with Burke.
And that's an interesting thought, though, because as creators of music, I suppose you have somewhat of a different perspective on hearing music as well, because you kind of have a sense of how it's made, and so how do you approach kind of not only your own music, but music that you hear, and maybe if you're at festivals or when they were still allowed, when you heard other people play, what would you think? Is it more almost like an objective thought, or is it still a very visceral thing?
I mean, to speak further to that, and I won't blabber on too much, but I think that like it's really about trying to establish, like I said, like this sound that seems bigger than the sum of its parts, right? Like you can function and hear a song, somebody playing the song, and say, wow, what a great guitar part, what a beautiful vocal melody, what a lyric, but what you're really trying to do, I think, is to stitch those things together and make them almost imperceptible without each other, and certain bands come to mind, that do that really well. When I think about like REM or something, and the way they use feedback to sort of like stitch together these like really poetic but quite literal lyrical ideas with this kind of like folky backdrop, this indie rock backdrop. I think it really like it's clear when you see these elements come up, these feedbacks that kind of guide them into each other. And I think as a band, as a rock and roll band, you want to sound like yourselves. You want to sound like a larger sum rather than than these tiny sum, like the small parts that make up the music. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
No, I get that. So in that sense then, because you do have a very, I would say, distinctive identity in terms of what you play, even though you can play anything. And I think the way you use your voices, it will still sound like you. But is that kind of like a tightrope thing where you're trying to balance your identity on the one hand, but also try to move forward in a way?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess we definitely have the innate human need to please people. So definitely it's, a thought that comes up, particularly when venturing into new territory of like, whoa, this sounds like something we've never done before. Definitely wondering about like, I mean, that's the thing about the identity of our band. It should be whatever we decide that it is. and you're right, like obviously having two voices that get to experiment with each other. And I think on this album, we definitely experiment more with like the balance of singing, whereas in the past, it was always really, really important as a mandated decision that we always were represented like 50-50 within each song. And then I think through, not that it wasn't painful and difficult at times to sometimes like let go of where the song is going and say like, I trust where this is going. But I do think that it comes from like trusting each other as artists and starting to let go of like, maybe this is better if I don't sing on it, or maybe this is better if you don't play that, like you play an electronic bass on it instead of your regular bass, or maybe it's better if we put in some drum machine rather than just what we've always said of like, we're a rock and roll band and it has to be this way. The element of like space and time and being able to, we made this album by being able to go to this place that we call the Jam Shed, which is our friend's little coach house in the back of his backyard that's like really close to where most of us live. And we basically just went there Monday to Friday for maybe over a year and treated writing this album, you know, I don't want to say like a day job because that makes it sound like it wasn't enjoyable or that it was like something that was a duty that we had to complete, but very much the opposite. It was like a space where we could come and we could, you know, spend hours talking and then spend hours jamming and then, you know, talk about real feelings and process what was happening in the world. And yeah, like having the energy of just like space to do that by letting go of like the constant forward motion of like tour, right, get the songs out, get them played on the radio, like that kind of thing, which I think is like a part of capitalism and a part of the music industry and a part of any industry. Just by being able to like let the foot off the gas a bit, I feel like we were able to like trust new territory. But yes, like the fear is that will fail miserably and people will hate it.
I don't think that will happen. I think you're all right. But it sounds like a very liberating process then. So what's this whole album process? A lot more pressure-free, because like you say, well, the second album you still want to make those hits, but and then now you let the song be the song, and you kind of check your ego at the door. So was it a lot more liberating in a way to work in this fashion?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it was, you know, I remember there was like a moment where, I don't know, I think we had gotten an award for the second record or something, and it clicked, and we made a joke that was like, well, I guess we can just make an experimental third record. Like, you know, just like finally we can just not really overthink anything and just kind of go for it. And it felt that way. I mean, I think that we all have like really strong feelings about, you know, like any artist, you want people to emote and you want people to feel things that they may not have felt before and maybe open themselves up a bit, and identify, and dance, you know, like these sort of like really visceral feelings that kind of happen when we hear music that we love. I don't know. It was just really special to kind of try things out and let it all kind of just roll out how it did, you know, instead of like going in with some narrative. I think ultimately we did come out with a record that definitely gels together and sort of feels like a bit of like a concept, you know, but it was only just because all of the tensions in the world that were surrounding us as we wrote were so hard to tune out that I think we ended up with a record that really just kind of comes across as like putting yourself out there and being vulnerable and being showing your cards, you know, like there's no time anymore for us to like hide behind masks and like a facade. And so I think that the record ended up being this really kind of beautiful love letter to like being vulnerable and just putting yourself out there, even though that's really, you know, terrifying to do. So yeah, it was very liberating.
As artists in general, is that a difficult thing to do? Because I suppose in a way that's kind of the job, right? You make something, you put it out there, and you have people judge it, which is a very vulnerable position. So how have you? What are your thoughts on that concept in a way? How have you dealt with it over the years, and is that still something that you worry about?
Yes. I feel like in the past, particularly like with our first album, we released it once and then we toured for a year, mostly in Canada, and then we released it again, and we kind of just started a process of always being on the road. And so there wasn't necessarily, and also just like having to, like being a new band and having to go and introduce yourself to new territories and like go to new countries for the first time and stuff like that. It's like this song would be out in this place and this song would be out in this place. So it didn't really feel like in the way that it did with the second album and that it does now, where it's like you made this thing, we have now the team around us and the supports around us, that it's like the album comes out and it goes everywhere. This song comes out and it goes everywhere. I mean, and by everywhere, I mean like to the people who care. I don't mean like we're a world famous band, but yeah, I think being isolated in this time, like we were already kind of starting, it was like the beginning of March, I think, or April when we put out Pay For It. Be like having to sit with the feelings of like, we created this thing together and we're all its parents and we love it so dearly and so desperately, and now we release it to the world, and there's a bit of I never realized it before, but there's like a bit of a grieving process that happens with that when it's not just yours anymore. And obviously all you're doing while you're sitting on it is like, we got to get this out there. We haven't released music in 4 years. Like we've got to do it. We've got to do it. But then it happens and it's like, and then you read one comment that's like, this sucks or whatever. And you're like, oh, like my baby, no.
There goes the rest of your week.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's like something that I personally need to work on, where it's just like having the awareness of like, I don't know, trusting intuition, I guess, and just feeling like this is what came out and this is what it is. And what it's like that teaching of like what other people say about you, and in this case, your art, like it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. I think that's something to really embrace. I guess I just never realized how important it is to embrace that mentality of like, of that it's not about you, because we just would release a song, but we would be on tour. And so you might feel complicated about it, but you're having the instant rush of like going out and playing in this city that you haven't been for a whole year, and you get the rush of the crowd and you have the dopamine hit, and then you go to the next city, and it's just like that constant motion. And yeah, releasing songs in isolation is definitely, there's a lot of time for stewing.
There are personal thoughts in a way, even though they're not always direct and like literal in a way. They are very personal thoughts and ideas that you put on the album. So putting that out for people, is that easy to kind of share your inner thoughts, or how do you cope with kind of putting out those very personal thoughts and ideas?
Ooh. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that this is probably the most personal album that we've ever put out, and part of it comes from the fact that most of our other songs that we've released in the past, we've really written in this collaborative way lyrically, where it's like editing each other's thoughts and words and like trying to express these two different opinions. And now it's like there's just songs where Peter wrote all the lyrics, and it's very personal to him, and that's part of like his process and what he was going through. And then same for me. And so I think it will, I mean, a lot of them aren't out yet.
Sure.
So I think it'll be an exploration of trust and also, I guess, on the positive side, to release something to the world that you wrote because it was healing, like, or I'll speak about myself. For me to release something to the world that was healing for me to write in a time where, you know, when it came through, it wasn't about, this is going to be a July Talk song. It was just, I need to write this because this is what I'm going through right now. And the gift of being able to then share that song and feeling safe enough to share that song with my dear collaborators and have them say, this is great. This should be in the world. And then to take it from, you know, a very simple idea written on guitar to like a full arrangement and a full supported song so that it becomes a July Talk song. Because I think the thing we always say is that none of us are capable of writing an entire July Talk song by ourselves. What makes it our band is that we all put our fingerprints on it. Yeah, I feel that is a great gift and a privilege to be able to do that. And it's also a bit terrifying.
Sure, I can imagine.
And to add to that, I mean, I think it occurs to me that I don't know whether this happens after you've written songs for a long while or whether it's just when you start writing songs, it's already like this. I don't remember. But oftentimes I find that I'll like, you know, I'll find a few chords that string together that I like the way they sound, and I'll start singing to it. And the lyrics that initially come from a place so deep inside yourself that you're not quite ready to like actually say them out loud or like face what they mean. And, you know, like any songwriter, you have, you know, your notebook of ideas that you're kind of always harking back. Oh, what was that idea I had going a while back? You know, I really like that. And recently I had an experience where I like, you know, I've done a bit like of work in the past year of like dealing with some old demons that I had from earlier in my life. And I ended up falling back on this song that I had written earlier, and I couldn't play it because I had faced these like really deep, hateful things inside me since. And the song was like, just this like, so clear how obvious that it was about these battles that I had been taking part in. But because I had sort of faced them and put them forward, when I tried to replay it, like I fell apart because I didn't even know it. It was like a sort of a subconscious channeling. And so I think that you often really need to get these kind of ideas and these battles out of you. And then you realize later on, like, oh my God, like I thought that was just like an abstract song, but I'm clearly processing things that are so deep and things that I'm not able to talk about. You know, I'm not able to bring up.
Is that where the songwriting comes in, then that you can put into words and you can express things that are perhaps difficult to talk about or to express? Is that
what I think you sometimes got to be careful, because sometimes you write a song about it and you're like, oh, I've dealt with that now. And you're like, oh yeah.
it takes more than just writing one song. If we can finally then just go into one particular song specifically. I have one that I like, but if there's one in particular that you prefer to delve into, that's fine as well. But I really like "See You Through" as well.
Oh, cool. That's cool. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was an oldie, and like I had been working on it for a really long time. And Burke at the space, I mean, it was this idea that how polarized the world has become and how difficult it is to see people in this sort of Montague and Capulet way, where it's like, if you're on one side, you're on one side. If you're on the other, you're on the other. And I think that really felt like there was something to learn from a sort of almost like allegorical love story of liberation and of separation between people. But Burke, when we started recording it at that farm studio, he took it to this world where it like all of a sudden really got into like a sort of a Beck sea change kind of arrangement. And it was the first time that I sort of sang in that style, where it's like very whispered and very like understated rather than what I usually do, which is like quite loud and blowing out the room or whatever. So yeah, it was a really special song, and I hope that we can you know, Leah and I often joke that like if this record, like if songs like See You Through and Pay For It like hit, then like we might be able to just write ballads for the rest of our lives.
I love that.
It's so much fun to write ballads. Obviously we want to rock and like play live, but it's so special to have the opportunity and like the freedom. Like some bands don't get to like sit down and write these like slow atmospheric arrangements, and it's really fun to do, and it's like really where we feel comfortable in some ways. And then, you know, obviously live we really want to like communicate that harder energy. But I feel very lucky that we got to do See You Through.
But that's interesting. So this type of vocals you've never done before, this kind of more subdued.
No, more subdued. There's like some like falsetto-y stuff on that track. Like it's like really gentle, and like the whole idea was supposed to be like, you know, I can still see you through the walls of Jericho, like the first walls that ever, you know, separated people really, like in human history, and like, and yet to do it as this like really like whispered close vocal, I felt like the just when you sit and play it on the Wurlitzer, like it feels more passionate if we're trying to speak to each other through vast distances, but like you can't, because but it's still like a whisper through like that's supposed to carry on for miles, you know. I don't know, I liked that sort of like paradox a little bit. I thought that was cool.
I think for me that song also is like we had a song that didn't make this album that's called The End of the World, and I think that a lot of the themes that were that kept coming up in band discussions and stuff, they're pretty grim and dark and really feeling. It's so interesting to now be in this time where you're like, we thought the world was on fire then. The world is on fire now.
I remember people saying 2016 is the worst year ever and everything. And
totally.
So yeah, that's interesting.
But that song kind of came from like, or at least like my experience of that song. I think it's okay for us to have different experiences with that song. But like when we were, when I felt like I understood that song and I understood what Pete was getting at, and I felt able to engage with it and for it to like become a conversation, it was like, the day that I think we had a big breakthrough on it lyrically was like a day that started by entering the space and just like really being full of tears and anger and frustration in the world, and feeling, you know, just in a really big kind of like spiral of depressive thoughts and stuff that's directly linked to the state of the world, and feeling the weight of the world, and you know, wanting to give up, and then having that song be like a healing moment for me and for us to be able to talk about like getting through it together and why it's worth trying.
Yeah, exactly. That idea of that. This is going to be the end, but that idea of our focusing on our common humanity rather than everything that separates us. I think it's a very, very important thing that we need to remind ourselves of continuously for it to even improve a little bit. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thanks for talking to us.